What's going on, everybody? James Jackson here. Apologies if the audio is different. I'm going to be getting ready to go out walking on a hike, but I figure I would just tell you what this video is going to be. Right now, I'm out back at Valley Forge, and today I would just figure this would be a good time to test, or I figure this would be a good time to talk about dynamic range and really the truth about dynamic range, because there's a lot to be said. There's a lot of things of, oh, what's a good dynamic range camera, or this camera doesn't have good dynamic range. You need at least 13 stops, 14 stops of dynamic range because things get out. And honestly there's a lot to be said about dynamic range, and I figured what's a good way to just go out and talk about it. For example, to sort of start off um, with a couple myth bustings. The GH6 is supposedly not having really good dynamic range, even though now the quoted is 13 plus stops of dynamic range, but a lot of the tests from YouTubers and other people like Cine D is that this camera is really about 11 and a half stops of dynamic range. And they say, well, that is not good enough. Well, right now I'm in my car. There's no additional lights inside the car. And so it's pretty dark in the back. And we got outside. You tell me, does this look like bad dynamic range? Let's continue to test it out, shall we? So here's a good example of Latitude Performance as I'm, cars causing by, so hopefully you can hear me. But right now I'm standing under shades. It's a bit hot, still windy, but still a bit hot. And so sitting in shade with the background blowing out at me. And this is a camera that many people don't say that doesn't put out, a good amount of dynamic range. About usable stops, about 11 and a half stops. And as you can see here, I still got all the information in my skin. I'm about a stop to a stop and a half underexposed with my skin. With this just being, going from being clipped. And as you can see, I'm still capturing a whole bunch of detail, going from a log image to a Rec 709 image. So I guess the question is, if something like this that's only has about 11 and a half useful stops is, and I think this is like midday, mid-sun, so very harsh. There's not that much clouds to diffuse the sun, so this is a very harsh setting environment. So if something like this is able to capture all the information with about 11 and a half stops, then the question that we need to ponder, and what we hope to ponder for the rest of this video, is what is the use case for dynamic range of cameras with better performances, both in the highlights and the shadows. So let's go to that and discuss that. So the second truth regarding dynamic range is the fact that most productions typically expose a lot of their entire scenes at a full increments of 10 stops. So basically they expose for a 10 stop variable, which is far lower than anything that happens of 16, 15. Really anything above that has to do with more of just giving coverage if for some reason you accidentally overexpose or underexpose. Like right now, we're a little bit under it, we're a little bit overexposed for our clouds as we're going to be exposed for our face. So if I was to adjust this in D to where for the clouds now, because now I got all the information, but as you can see, I am pretty much underlit right now, but fear not. That is the benefits of having light like this. So right now, let's put this to where we're going to just try to just throw a little bit more onto the skin. And as you can see, now my skin is brought up, and if I was to even go all the way up to max, now my skin is actually properly exposed. It's showing properly exposed on this, and this is just one little light that I just can carry around that I can carry around, like right now, just sitting on the table, chatting with you guys, and I can sit here and basically expose for my skin, and now I'm also exposed for the background, for the clouds as well. So everything is in place, and even if my skin is a little bit under, it's only by like a quarter of a stop, so it's easy to pull up and bring up in post. So this is really the truth, is that while 14, 15, 16 stops is great, and the sun now actually comes back, so I don't need this as much now that the sun comes back in the frame. But the truth of the matter is the fact that most productions prepare a scene for 10 stops. And so even though 14, 15 stops will sound cool and it'll be great, it doesn't really necessarily really be needed. And the reason why it's not even as much needed is what we will go into, which is the third truth about dynamic range in just a moment. Woo! Look at that. Look at that back there. Look at all that beauty back there. Whew. Oh man. Look at that. That looks gorgeous. That looks gorgeous back out there. So the next truth about dynamic range is about display, or in case delivery. The truth is, most of us, probably like 95, like worst case scenario 95, but most likely 99% of us that do film and deliver, we're delivering in a Rec 709. We're delivering to Rec 709. That is our delivery. We're delivering to, especially if you're delivering to social media. YouTube, you may be delivering to HDR, but overall you're probably delivering to 709. The truth of the matter is, a Rec 709 output is really outputting an image that is giving about, I would say, anywhere between 6 to 7, maybe 8 stops of dynamic range. So when you take your log format and convert it into a Rec 709, you're essentially basically compressing it to a 6-7 stop image. So when you actually think about it like that, we're not actually even using or maximizing those dynamic range, at least in terms of delivery. The dynamic range is all about the acquisition, making sure you can have scenes like this where I got the sky in the background. I can pull that and I can still capture an amazing array of dynamic range. But when we get into the edit, we're automatically coming in. But like I said, most productions professionally, they light, set, and expose to about 10 stops. So really, what is the point of all these extra stops of dynamic range? And the truth of the matter is that all these extra dynamic range is really all about making sure that if for some reason you overexpose by like 1 stop or somehow expose over 2 stops, you are able to still recover and you still got the whole image. Or if you underexpose something, you're able to pull it up and be able to still maximize that image. And that's really the point of sort of these higher ends. But honestly, we have been working with cameras that deliver 10, 11 stops for years. So if anybody wants to sit here is maybe not looking at the GH6, or may say the GH6 is not a good camera because it doesn't have that high dynamic range, it only does true 11.5 stops, here's the final truth. Most cameras, whether they're full frame, Super 35, majority of them are in 12 stops, the lower 12 stop range. So 12, 12, and 12.3, sort of that. That's where majority of them are. Now, some of the higher ones, when you get to things like the to higher end cameras, like say the S1H, you'll get to 12.5, and then you can even get to something like the Komodo, that gives, I believe, about 12.7, and then you get something like the C70, which teeters somewhere between the 12.8 to 13 stops of dynamic range. It really isn't until you get to something like the Sony Venice cameras and the Aria Alexa cameras that you get to that 13, beyond 13 plus stops of true dynamic range, not necessarily the dynamic range that the camera manufacturers are telling you. So, and honestly, that 1 to 2 stop difference, in most situations, you're not going to notice. Now, there are situations where this does make a difference, and I'm not here to say it doesn't make a difference. There is. I understand for a lot of documentarians, or if you are doing way more run and gun, where you don't have a lot of light, you don't have a lot of control of the scene, such as maybe you at a wedding. Particularly, this is true with like weddings, during preparations, where you got this big old window, and that's pretty much the only light, whereas everything else is dark. But even in those situations, I have found ways to just bring in a light and able to light my subject, to light a subject. I'll just have somebody that has something like this, like right now, dark side of my face, and then I throw this on here, and just light it up, and just throw this on, and essentially this lights it up. But or I bring something like a Forza 60 or a Forza 150 and sort of give some ambience to the room, and that fills up the room pretty well. The only time I've ever have an extreme case scenario was where I was filming a wedding, and we was the ceremony, and the inside, it was in a wooden it was in an open wooden like an open wooden I'm blanking on what they're called, but where basically the inside was like very underexposed, very underlit, and because they were open, all of the lights from the sun was hitting the outside, and where the bride and the groom were sitting, they were like right on the edges. So you had to either decide to go expose for outside, but then you lose the bride and groom, or you have to overexpose and then clip the highlights. And that's sort of a situation that we had, or at least my friend had. Now, I had the Canon C70 where I could capture both informations on the outside because it has one of the best dynamic range performances. I think even Cine D, they had their database. I believe they ranked the C70 as the 7th best performing dynamic range camera in terms of their signal to noise ratio. The C70 is like the 7th best dynamic range performing camera, and all the other cameras except for one are like $15,000 and more. Just a sort of little reference to you guys. But let's carry on, shall we? Hi guys, welcome back to the studio. I'm back here. We're going to wrap up the talk about dynamic range really quickly. So let's just quickly recap everything we discussed while we were out. Number one, even though the GH6 supposedly only has 11.5 of true stops of dynamic range, and I'm not dismissing either things from people like Gerald Dunn or Cine D, I think they do terrific work. But the truth of the matter is, it's about how you use the camera and how you use the tools. And in most productions, we're all exposing typically for about 10 stops of dynamic range. So anything above 10 stops of dynamic range is still really good. Number two, the more important things is about the roll-offs of the highlights and into the shadows. How do they behave? How do they interact? And number three, a lot of the solutions can be solved with simple things of just understanding lighting and lighting techniques. You can add these things in. As I showed multiple times, it doesn't take amount of light. It just takes an understanding of how lighting works. So before we come off and we bash another camera because it only has 12 or 12.5 or 15, or it doesn't have 16, 17 stops, which I love what's coming with the RELX 35, but at the same time, I'm like, at the end of the day, you got to be about knowing your camera and exposing your camera. You know, this doesn't have necessarily the greatest dynamic range, but I know how to use the Lumix GH6, and it has been working extremely well for me, and I couldn't be happier with it. And if you know how to do the dynamic range and how to work with the dynamic range, it can deliver you some of the greatest images possible. And this goes to other cameras like Zcam, Blackmagic cameras, or Kinfinity cameras. A lot of these cameras that or even Canon, like the Canon R5s or some of these other Canon cameras that get knocked off for not having these ridiculous video dynamic ranges that we are seeing, but it's also dynamic range that typically we're not going to see. And it comes down to that final truth, which is the fact that when we're delivering our video content, especially if we're delivering for Rec 709, you're really only delivering ultimately 7 to 8 stops of dynamic range. So before we just go crazy about trying to dismiss cameras left and right on if they have good image quality or not, how about we just try to understand our cameras first and make sure we max out and make sure we fully put them through rigorous tests to see if they are compatible for our work. But this does it for me. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know. Leave your comments below. And as always, if you like the content, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And until next time, take care, everyone.